The black sedan slowed at exactly 6:42 a.m., its polished surface catching the pale glow of a rising winter sun, as if the city itself were holding its breath for what he was about to see. Ethan Caldwell didn't notice the light at first, or the quiet hum of early traffic along the avenue, or the faint hiss of tires passing over damp asphalt. His attention snapped to a single figure standing beneath the bus stop shelter, a figure he hadn't seen in years yet recognized instantly, not by movement or voice, but by the stillness she carried like armor. Nyla Brooks stood with one hand curled around the strap of a worn leather bag, the other holding a small boy close against her side, and for a moment the world around Ethan narrowed into something fragile and dangerously quiet, as if one wrong breath might shatter it. He didn't step out right away. He couldn't. His fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel, the leather cool beneath his palms, his mind already moving faster than the city outside his window, calculating, recalling, rejecting. It wasn't supposed to be her. Not here. Not like this. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction, but Ethan said nothing. His gaze locked forward as the child shifted slightly in Nyla's arms, enough for the early light to catch his face. That was when something inside Ethan stilled completely. It wasn't resemblance in the way people casually notice similarities between strangers. It was precision, detail for detail, like someone had taken a photograph of Ethan at 4 years old and placed it gently into another body. The curve of the boy's cheek, the line of his nose, even the quiet, almost stubborn way his lips pressed together. It wasn't coincidence, and Ethan knew it before logic could intervene. His breath slowed, then caught, then steadied again as if his body were trying to keep up with a realization his mind hadn't fully allowed yet. Nyla didn't look surprised to see him. That was what unsettled him more than anything else. She didn't flinch, didn't turn away, didn't even shift her stance. She simply looked at him with a calm that felt deliberate, measured, like someone who had already walked through every version of this moment long before it arrived. Ethan opened the door. The sound was soft, controlled, but it echoed louder in his ears than it should have as his shoes met the pavement. Each step toward her slow, precise, as if he were approaching something that could either ground him or undo him entirely. The city moved around them, cars passing, a distant siren somewhere blocks away, the low murmur of voices, but none of it reached the space between them. When he stopped a few feet away, he didn't look at her first. He looked at the child. The boy shifted again, small fingers gripping the fabric of Nyla's coat, his eyes lifting just enough to meet Ethan's for a brief, unguarded second, and in that glance, something inside Ethan tightened in a way he couldn't name. He forced his gaze upward. Nyla's expression didn't change. "Say it," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something sharper beneath the surface, something that betrayed the tension coiling in his chest. She didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if she were giving him space to hear what he already knew. Ethan felt the seconds stack, each one pressing harder against his composure, his mind already beginning to move, to calculate, to align dates and distances and decisions he had buried under years of forward motion. "Say it," he repeated, quieter this time, the edge replaced with something more dangerous, certainty waiting to be confirmed. Nyla adjusted her hold on the boy slightly, not to protect him, but to steady herself, her gaze never leaving Ethan's. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, wasn't emotional, wasn't anything close to dramatic. It was simple. "He's yours." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, precise and unyielding. And for a moment Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. The city seemed to continue without him, the rhythm of it indifferent to the shift that had just taken place. Inside his mind, something began to run. Not panic. Not yet. Calculation. Dates surfaced first, sharp and immediate. The last time he had seen Nyla. The conversation that ended everything. The weeks that followed when he had buried himself in work, in meetings, in decisions that had felt urgent enough at the time to justify everything else. He could see it clearly, the timeline he had lived by, the version of events he had accepted without question. But now there was another timeline, one he hadn't accounted for, one that didn't align cleanly with the narrative he had built. He stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but to create space, as if distance might give him clarity. That doesn't, he started, then stopped, because the sentence didn't hold. He tried again, more controlled. The timing, his voice trailed, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the words didn't fit the shape of the realization forming in his chest. Nyla watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something steadier, something that carried weight without needing to show it. "You left," she said, her tone even, her words measured, as if she had said them before, maybe to herself, maybe in moments when there had been no one else to hear them. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't know," he said, the instinctive defense rising before he could filter it, before he could question whether it even mattered. Nyla tilted her head just slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just enough to acknowledge the statement without accepting it. "You didn't stay," she replied. The difference settled between them like something solid. Ethan's mind kept moving, faster now, less controlled, the clean lines of his internal timeline beginning to blur at the edges. He could see the gap, the space where something had happened without him, something that had continued forward while he had walked away convinced there was nothing left behind. His gaze dropped again to the boy, to the small, unmistakable details that refused to be explained away. The child shifted closer to Nyla, his hand tightening around her coat, his eyes still curious, still unaware of the weight of the moment unfolding around him. Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, something heavier than surprise, sharper than confusion. It wasn't just the realization of what stood in front of him. It was the understanding of when it had begun. The timeline wasn't broken. It was intact. And that was what terrified him. Because if the timeline held, if every date aligned the way his mind was beginning to piece together, then there was only one conclusion left. He hadn't missed something. He had left it behind before it even had a chance to reach him. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a controlled release that did nothing to ease the tension building beneath it. He looked at Nyla again, really looked at her this time, at the quiet strength in her posture, the absence of accusation in her expression, the way she stood not as someone seeking acknowledgement, but as someone who had already accepted what had been done. "How long?" he asked, his voice steadier now, but carrying a weight it hadn't held before. Nyla didn't hesitate. "For years," she said. The numbers settled into place instantly, locking into the calculations still running through Ethan's mind, confirming what he had already begun to see. For years. The timeline closed around him, precise and undeniable, leaving no space for reinterpretation, no room for the version of events he had relied on. Ethan didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't ask another question. Because in that moment, he understood something far more unsettling than the existence of a child he hadn't known about. He understood that there had never been a gap at all, only a decision, and it had been his. The bus doors hissed open with a tired mechanical breath, the sound cutting clean through the silence that had settled between them, and for a moment neither of them moved as if the world itself had offered an exit and they were both refusing to take it. Nyla shifted first, not hurried, not hesitant, simply deliberate, guiding the boy a step closer to the curb as the early morning passengers began to gather behind her, their presence quiet but growing, a reminder that this moment was not isolated, that life outside their collision continued without pause. Ethan noticed the way she positioned herself slightly between him and the child, not protective in a dramatic sense, but instinctive, practiced, like a habit formed over years rather than seconds. And that detail settled deeper than anything she had said because it spoke of time, of repetition, of a life that had moved forward without him in ways he could no longer ignore. He took a step closer, just enough to narrow the distance, but not enough to intrude, his voice lower now, less sharp, but carrying something heavier than before, something edged with the realization that control had already slipped from his hands. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, the question landing softer than he expected, as if even his own voice understood the weight of what it was asking. Nyla did not turn toward him immediately, her attention on the boy as she adjusted the collar of his jacket, smoothing it down with a small, precise motion that felt intimate in its simplicity, and when she finally looked up, there was no defensiveness in her eyes, no urgency to explain, only a calm that made the question feel almost misplaced. "You made it very clear you were leaving," she said, her tone even, not accusing, not emotional. just factual in a way that left no space for interpretation. Ethan's jaw tightened again, the memory surfacing whether he wanted it or not. The last conversation replaying with a clarity that felt sharper now than it had in the moment. The way he had stood in that apartment with his phone buzzing in his hand, the pressure of a deal closing, the board expecting immediate action, the narrative he had constructed about priorities and timing and what could wait. He had believed he was making a necessary choice, a temporary distance that would eventually resolve itself. But standing here now, watching the quiet certainty in Nyla's posture, he felt the first fracture in that belief widen into something more permanent. "I would have come back," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could weigh them. Before he could test whether they still held any truth, Nyla held his gaze for a moment longer than before, and in that brief extension of silence, something unspoken passed between them, something that acknowledged the statement without accepting it. "You did not," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have. The boy shifted again, his small hand slipping into Nyla's, fingers curling with a natural familiarity that Ethan could not help but notice. And when the child looked up at him this time, there was curiosity there, open and unguarded, not recognition, not fear, just the quiet interest of a child noticing someone new in his space. Ethan felt that look settle somewhere deeper than he expected, not because of what it was, but because of what it was not. There was no connection in it, no instinctive pull, no sign that this child knew him in any way beyond a stranger standing too close. The realization pressed against his chest with a weight that was difficult to name, something that felt like absence more than anything else, the absence of moments that should have existed but did not. "What is his name?" Ethan asked, his voice steadier now, but carrying a quiet edge that betrayed how much the answer mattered. Nyla did not hesitate this time. "Noah," she said, and the name settled into the space between them with a softness that contrasted everything else unfolding around it. Ethan repeated it once under his breath, not loud enough for either of them to respond, as if testing how it felt, how it fit into the reality he was only beginning to understand. Noah glanced up again at the sound, his head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing in that small, thoughtful way children have when they are trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. And for a brief second, Ethan saw himself in that expression so clearly it was almost disorienting. He looked away first, his gaze shifting back to Nyla as the pieces continued to align in his mind. Faster now, less controlled, the timeline no longer a question but a structure closing in around him. "For years," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a confirmation. And Nyla nodded once, a small motion that sealed the understanding without needing to repeat it. The bus driver glanced out from his seat, the subtle impatience of someone on a schedule showing in the brief pause before he tapped the doorframe lightly, a signal that time was moving whether they were ready or not. A few passengers stepped forward behind Nyla, the quiet shuffle of shoes against concrete adding a layer of pressure to the moment, a reminder that decisions could not be delayed indefinitely. Ethan felt the shift, the narrowing of opportunity, and something in him resisted it instinctively, a reflex built from years of controlling outcomes and refusing to let moments pass without action. "Nyla," he said, and this time her name carried something different, less controlled, more urgent. "We need to talk about this." The words came out measured, but the urgency beneath them was unmistakable. Nyla held his gaze, her expression unchanged, and for a second it seemed like she might respond, might engage, might open a door that had been closed for years. But instead she glanced down at Noah, then back at the bus, then finally back at Ethan, her decision already made long before this moment arrived. "There is nothing to talk about," she said, her tone still calm, still steady, but final in a way that did not invite negotiation. Ethan felt something tighten again, sharper this time, the instinct to push, to argue, to insist rising quickly, but the words stalled as he looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not resistance, but resolution. This was not a conversation she was avoiding, it was one she had already finished on her own terms. Noah tugged gently at her hand, a small, unconscious reminder of the world he existed in, separate from Ethan, separate from everything that had just been revealed, and Nyla responded immediately, her attention shifting without hesitation, grounding herself in the present rather than the past. She guided him toward the bus steps, her movements smooth, practiced, as if she had done this exact routine countless times before. Mornings measured in schedules and small hands and quiet responsibilities that did not include the man standing behind her. Ethan watched, the realization settling deeper with each step she took away from him, the physical distance mirroring something far more permanent. "You do not get to walk away again," he said, the words leaving him before he could soften them, before he could decide whether they were fair or even accurate. Nyla paused at the first step, not turning fully, just enough for her voice to carry back to him without breaking the line she had already chosen. "I am not the one who walked away," she replied, and then she stepped up, guiding Noah with her, the bus door framing them for a brief second before closing with a soft, final sound that echoed louder in Ethan's mind than it should have. He stood there as the bus pulled away, its movement slow at first, then steady, then disappearing into the flow of morning traffic, taking with it the only tangible connection he had to a reality he was only beginning to comprehend. Ethan did not move immediately, his gaze fixed on the space where the bus had been, his mind still running, still calculating, but now with a different urgency, one that was not about understanding the past, but about what came next. Because for the first time in years, the future he had planned felt incomplete, shaped by an absence he could no longer ignore. And as the city continued to move around him, indifferent and unchanged, Ethan Caldwell realized that the only thing he could not calculate was whether he was already too late. The bus disappeared into the stream of morning traffic, its taillights swallowed by the rhythm of the city, but Ethan Caldwell remained standing at the curb as if the moment had anchored him in place, his eyes fixed on the space it had left behind, while everything else continued without hesitation. The low hum of engines, the distant sound of a crosswalk signal counting down, the faint rustle of wind against the glass shelter all pressed in around him, but none of it reached the center of his focus where a single realization kept tightening with each passing second. For years was not just a number, it was structure, it was sequence, it was proof, and for a man who had built his entire life on precision and timing, it was something far more dangerous than uncertainty because it could not be argued. It could only be accepted. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him measured and controlled. But his grip on that control was thinner now, stretched by something unfamiliar, something that did not respond to logic the way everything else in his world usually did. The driver stepped out of the car a few feet behind him, hesitant, waiting for instruction that did not come, and after a moment Ethan moved, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the deliberate motion of someone who had already made a decision he did not fully understand yet. He opened the rear door and slid into the seat, the leather cool and familiar beneath him, the quiet luxury of the interior pressing in with a sense of normalcy that felt almost disconnected from what had just happened. The door closed with a soft, sealed sound, cutting off the noise of the street, leaving him in a space where the only thing left was the sound of his own breathing and the steady rhythm of his thoughts. "Follow that bus," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a firmness that left no room for hesitation. The driver nodded once, already moving, the engine responding with a smooth, controlled power as the car merged into traffic, slipping into the current without drawing attention. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting forward, tracking the route he knew the bus would take, calculating distances, timing, intersections, every detail aligning instinctively as his mind returned to the systems it trusted. But beneath that familiar process, something else moved, something less structured, less predictable, something that refused to be reduced to numbers or sequences. Images surfaced instead, not abstract, not distant, but precise. Nyla standing under the shelter, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, the way she had said his name without hesitation, without softness, without anything that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. And then the boy, Noah, the name settling again into Ethan's mind with a weight that had not been there before, the shape of it now tied to a face he could not unsee. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not to rest, but to steady the flood of memory that followed. The last time he had been in that apartment, The afternoon light filtering through half-drawn curtains, the tension already present before a word had been spoken. He could see it. Clearly now, sharper than it had been then. The way Nyla had stood near the window, her arms crossed not defensively, but as if holding something in place, something she had not yet decided to reveal. His phone had buzzed again, the name on the screen one he could not ignore, the deal that would change everything. The pressure of expectation building from every direction at once. "I have to go," he had said, the words quick, almost automatic, shaped by urgency rather than intention. Nyla had not argued, had not raised her voice, had not tried to stop him. She had simply looked at him, that same calm in her eyes, that same steadiness that now felt far more significant than it had at the time. "Is that it?" she had asked, her voice quiet, not demanding, just seeking clarity. Ethan had not paused long enough to understand the question beneath the question, had not allowed himself to consider what she might be holding back, what she might be trying to say. "It is what it has to be," he had replied, already moving toward the door, already stepping into the version of his life that did not include her. The memory ended there, or at least that was where he had always let it end. But now, sitting in the back of the moving car, watching the city shift past the window, Ethan felt the edges of that moment expand, revealing what he had missed, what he had not stayed long enough to see. The car slowed slightly as traffic thickened near the next intersection, and ahead, just barely visible through the line of vehicles, he caught sight of the bus again. Its shape familiar now in a way it had not been minutes ago. His focus sharpened, not just on the vehicle, but on what it carried, on the life that had moved forward without him, on the years that had unfolded in parallel to his own, unseen, unacknowledged. "Do not lose it," he said quietly, his voice steady, his eyes fixed forward. The driver adjusted course with a subtle shift, maintaining distance without drawing attention, the car moving with practiced ease through the flow of traffic. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together, a posture that felt less like control and more like containment, as if he were holding something in place that threatened to break loose if he allowed it. His mind returned again to the timeline, not as a question, but as a structure he could now see clearly from beginning to end. The night he left, the weeks that followed, the silence he had accepted without question, the absence he had justified as mutual, as final, as resolved. But it had not been resolved. It had simply continued without him, unfolding into something real. Something living, something that now had a name and a face and a presence he could no longer ignore. The bus slowed ahead, signaling for the next stop, and Ethan felt a shift in his chest, subtle but unmistakable, something closer to urgency now, not the calculated urgency of business or negotiation, but something more immediate, more personal, something that did not wait for perfect timing or complete information. The car slowed as well, maintaining distance, and Ethan watched as the doors of the bus opened again, passengers beginning to move, figures stepping down onto the sidewalk one by one. His gaze searched instinctively, scanning for the familiar shape, the steady posture, the small figure at her side. And when he saw them, stepping down together, moving with the same quiet rhythm he had already begun to recognize, something in him settled and tightened at the same time. They had not disappeared, not yet. And that was enough to shift everything. Ethan reached for the door handle before the car had fully stopped, his movements controlled but no longer restrained by hesitation. The driver spoke quietly, "Sir," but Ethan did not respond. The door opening as his shoes met the pavement once more, the city air sharper now, colder against his skin, grounding him in a way the enclosed space of the car could not. Nyla had not seen him yet, her attention on Noah as they stepped onto the sidewalk, her hand guiding him forward with the same steady assurance. But Ethan was already moving, closing the distance with measured steps, not rushing, not calling out, but refusing this time to let the moment pass without action, because the timeline had already been written, the past had already been decided. But what came next was still unwritten, and for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell was no longer willing to leave it that way. The distance between them closed faster this time, not because the street was shorter, but because Ethan Caldwell did not allow himself to hesitate, each step deliberate, grounded, His focus locked on the two figures moving ahead of him as if the rest of the city had faded into a soft blur around them. Nyla's pace did not change, her hand still wrapped around Noah's, guiding him along the sidewalk with the same quiet rhythm, the same steady presence that spoke of years built without interruption. And for a moment Ethan simply watched, not speaking yet, not breaking the pattern, absorbing the details that had once been invisible to him. Noah's stride was small but confident, his sneakers tapping lightly against the pavement, his free hand occasionally brushing against his jacket, as if he were still waking up to the day. And there was something about that simple, ordinary motion that pressed harder against Ethan's chest than anything dramatic could have, because it carried the weight of routine, of mornings repeated again and again without him. "Nyla," he said finally, his voice cutting through the space between them, controlled but firm, and this time she stopped. It was not abrupt, not startled, just a pause that felt intentional, as if she had already anticipated that he would follow, that this moment would not end at the curb. She turned slowly, guiding Noah to stand just slightly behind her side, not hiding him, not shielding him completely, but positioning herself in a way that made the boundary clear without needing to say it. Her eyes met Ethan's again, steady, unchanged, carrying the same calm that had unsettled him from the beginning. "You should not be here," she said, not as a warning, not as a command, but as a simple acknowledgement of what he had chosen to do. Ethan did not step back this time, did not soften his stance, because something in him had already shifted past that point. "I am not leaving," he replied, the words low, direct, carrying a certainty that had not been there earlier. Nyla studied him for a moment, her gaze moving across his face as if measuring something beyond the surface, something deeper than his words. And in that brief silence, Noah shifted slightly, peeking around her side, his eyes landing on Ethan with that same quiet curiosity. Ethan noticed it immediately, the way the child did not hide, did not shrink, but simply observed, and for a second, their eyes met again. The connection brief but undeniable in its impact. Ethan lowered himself slightly, not crouching fully, just enough to bring himself closer to Noah's eye level, his movements careful, deliberate, as if approaching something fragile. "Hey," he said softly, his voice changing in a way he did not plan, instinct taking over where logic usually ruled. Noah blinked once, his head tilting again, studying Ethan with a focus that felt older than his years, as if he were trying to place something he could not yet name. Nyla's hand tightened just slightly around Noah's, a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, but Ethan saw it, and he straightened again, respecting the boundary without stepping away from the moment entirely. "You cannot just show up and decide this matters now," Nyla said, her voice still calm, but this time there was something sharper beneath it, something that had been held back until now. Ethan met her gaze without flinching, the words settling into him with the weight they deserved. "It has always mattered," he replied, but even as he said it, he felt the flaw in the statement, the truth that contradicted it, the years where it had not mattered because he had not known, and the deeper truth that he had not stayed long enough to know. Nyla's expression shifted slightly, not into anger, not into frustration, but into something more grounded, something that carried the weight of lived experience rather than immediate emotion. "No," she said quietly. "It did not." And the certainty in her voice left no room for debate. Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself, not to argue, but to understand how to move forward from a place where he no longer held the advantage. "Then let it matter now," he said, the words simpler, less defensive, shaped by something closer to intention than reaction. Nyla looked at him for a long moment, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less like a barrier and more like a threshold, something that could be crossed or left behind depending on what came next. Noah shifted again, tugging lightly at her hand, his attention drifting momentarily to something further down the sidewalk, a passing dog, a distant sound, something small that reminded both of them that his world was still simple, still untouched by the complexities standing between the adults. Nyla glanced down at him, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second before returning to its steady state. And when she looked back at Ethan, there was a decision in her eyes, not final, but defined. "We have somewhere to be," she said, her tone even, not dismissive, but not inviting either. Ethan nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because he understood what she was doing, the way she was setting pace, setting terms, controlling the direction of what came next. "Then I will walk with you," he said, not asking, not demanding, simply stating it as the next step he was choosing. Nyla did not respond immediately, but she did not turn away either, and after a brief pause, she shifted slightly, allowing space beside her without explicitly offering it. Ethan stepped into that space, not too close, not too far, matching her pace as they began moving down the sidewalk together, Noah between them, but slightly closer. To Nyla, his small steps keeping rhythm with hers. The city moved around them, people passing, conversations blending into background noise, the normalcy of it all contrasting sharply with the tension woven through their quiet formation. Ethan kept his gaze forward, not because he was avoiding looking at Noah, but because he was aware of how much each glance meant now, how much weight it carried, how easily it could cross into something that Nyla was not ready to allow. "Where are you going?" he asked after a moment, his voice low enough to remain within their space, not drawing attention. "School," Nyla replied. The word simple, but it landed with a weight that surprised him, because it was not just a destination. It was another confirmation of time, of routine, of a life structured around responsibilities he had not been part of. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, his mind already mapping out what that meant, what it implied, how long that routine had been in place. "What does he like?" he asked, the question coming before he could filter it, before he could decide if it was too much, too soon. Nyla's steps did not falter, but there was a brief pause before she answered, as if weighing whether the question deserved a response. "Dinosaurs," she said finally, her tone neutral, but the answer carried a softness that had not been present in the rest of their conversation. Ethan felt something shift again, something small but significant, a detail that anchored Noah further into reality, into something more than just a revelation or a consequence. "Tyrannosaurus Rex," Noah said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear, the first time he had spoken directly into the space between them, and Ethan felt the impact of it immediately, not because of what was said, but because it was said at all. He glanced down, meeting Noah's eyes again, and this time there was something different in the look, not recognition, not yet, but engagement, a small bridge forming where there had been none. Ethan allowed himself a faint, controlled smile, not exaggerated, not overwhelming, just enough to meet the moment. "That is a good one," he said, his voice steady, respectful of the space he was stepping into. Nyla did not interrupt, did not pull Noah away from the exchange, but she did not encourage it either, her silence holding the balance between allowing and protecting. They continued walking, the distance to the school shortening with each step, and as the building came into view, modest, structured, filled with the quiet energy of early morning arrivals, Ethan felt the weight of what this place represented settle more firmly into him. This was not a moment, not a coincidence, not something that could be resolved with a single conversation. This was a life, already built, already moving, already complete in ways that did not include him. And yet, as he walked beside them, matching their pace, refusing this time to fall behind, Ethan Caldwell understood something with a clarity he had never needed before. He was not trying to rewrite the past anymore. He was stepping into the present, and whether he was allowed to stay there would no longer be his decision alone. The school entrance came into full view as they approached, a modest brick building softened by the early morning light, its glass doors reflecting the steady flow of parents and children moving in and out with practiced routine, and Ethan Caldwell felt something shift again, quieter this time, but heavier, as the reality of where they were heading settled into him with unmistakable clarity. This was not a passing moment, not a coincidence on a street corner. This was a place that belonged to Noah, a place tied to schedules, teachers, friendships, and days that had unfolded one after another without Ethan ever knowing they existed. Nyla did not slow her pace as they neared the entrance, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle tightening in her focus, a shift in attention that came naturally to someone preparing to hand off a child to the next part of his day. Noah, however, seemed to notice the building before anything else. his small steps quickening just slightly, his gaze lifting toward the doors with a familiarity that spoke of repetition, of mornings that followed the same pattern, and Ethan could not help but watch that detail closely. The way excitement or comfort or simple recognition moved through the child without hesitation. A few other parents stood nearby, exchanging brief greetings, adjusting backpacks, crouching to say final words before letting their children go. And Ethan observed it all with a heightened awareness, each interaction carrying a quiet significance that felt newly relevant. As if he were witnessing something he should have been part of long ago, Nyla stopped just short of the entrance, turning toward Noah with a small, practiced motion, kneeling slightly to adjust the strap of his backpack, her hands efficient, careful, familiar in a way that spoke of countless mornings just like this one. "You have everything," she asked softly, her voice shifting again, warmer now, grounded in something that had nothing to do with the tension beside her. Noah nodded, his expression focused as if the question mattered deeply, his small fingers checking the zipper before looking back up at her. "Lunch too," he said, his voice steady, and Nyla gave a small nod in return, her hand resting briefly against his shoulder. Ethan stood a step back, watching, not intruding, but not detached either, the scene unfolding in front of him with a quiet intimacy that carried more weight than any confrontation could have. He noticed the way Nyla's hand lingered just a second longer than necessary before pulling away, the way Noah leaned slightly into that touch without thinking, and something about that simple exchange settled deeper into Ethan's understanding of what had been built without him. Noah turned toward the entrance then, but paused, glancing back once more, his eyes moving between Nyla and Ethan in a way that suggested he was beginning to register the connection, even if he could not yet define it. "Bye," he said, the word directed primarily at Nyla, but his gaze flickered briefly toward Ethan at the end, as if acknowledging his presence in the smallest possible way. Ethan felt the moment immediately, subtle as it was, and he responded with a quiet nod, not overstepping, not claiming anything that had not been given. "Have a good day," he said, his voice calm, measured, and Noah gave a small nod in return before turning and walking toward the doors, his steps confident, his small figure merging into the flow of children entering the building. The doors opened and closed behind him, and just like that, he was gone from view, leaving behind a space that felt unexpectedly still. Nyla rose to her full height, her gaze lingering on the entrance for a brief second longer before she turned back toward Ethan, and the softness that had been present moments ago faded, replaced once again by the steady, controlled expression he had come to recognize. "You have seen him," she said, her tone even, not dismissive, but clear in its intent. "That does not change anything." Ethan held her gaze, the words settling between them with a weight that demanded a response. But this time he did not rush to fill the silence, did not reach for immediate argument or defense, because he understood now that this was not a conversation that could be forced forward by urgency alone. "It changes everything," he replied finally, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a depth that had not been there earlier, something grounded not in reaction, but in recognition. Nyla studied him again, her eyes searching, his face as if looking for something beyond the words, something that would either confirm or contradict what he was saying. "For you," she said after a moment, her tone steady. "Not for us." The distinction landed clean, precise, and Ethan felt it fully, not as a challenge, but as a boundary that had already been defined long before he arrived. He nodded once, acknowledging it, because denying it would only prove that he had not understood anything at all. "Then let me earn that," he said, the words deliberate, chosen carefully, not as a demand, but as a statement of intent. Nyla did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting briefly toward the entrance again before returning to him, and in that brief movement, Ethan saw something he had not seen before, not softness, not weakness, but consideration, a moment where the decision was not automatic, not already made. "You cannot earn 4 years," she said quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice, only truth, unfiltered and undeniable. Ethan inhaled slowly, the reality of that statement settling into him with a clarity he did not resist, because it was not something to argue against, it was something to accept. "No," he agreed, his voice steady. But I can start with today. Nyla's expression shifted slightly at that. Not enough to be called a change, but enough to be noticed, a small adjustment in the way she held her gaze. As if the words had reached a place she had not expected, the morning crowd continued to move around them, parents dispersing, the entrance growing quieter as the last of the children disappeared inside, and the world resumed its normal pace, leaving them standing in a space that felt briefly suspended between past and future. Why now? She asked suddenly, the question direct, not confrontational, but precise in a way that demanded honesty. Ethan did not look away, did not search for an easier answer, because he knew there was none that would hold. Because I saw him, he said simply, and the simplicity of it carried more truth than anything more complex could have. Nyla held his gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled softly, not in frustration, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of something that had shifted, even if only slightly. Seeing is not the same as staying, she said, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet weight that lingered in the air between them. Ethan nodded again, understanding that this was not about a single moment, not about a single decision, but about consistency, about presence, about something that could only be proven over time. Then I will stay, he replied. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice, no calculation behind the words. Just a clear, steady commitment that stood on its own. Nyla watched him for a long moment, the silence stretching once more, but this time it felt different, less like resistance and more like evaluation, as if she were deciding not whether to believe him, but whether to allow him the chance to prove it. The school doors remained closed behind her, the space around them quieting as the last of the morning activity faded. And for the first time since the moment began, there was no immediate movement pulling them in opposite directions. Nyla shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of her bag, her posture still composed, still controlled, but no longer entirely closed. We will see, she said finally, her voice even, not promising anything, not offering reassurance, but not shutting the door either. Ethan felt the weight of those 3 words settle into him, not as a victory, not as a resolution, but as something far more significant, an opening, however small, in a space that had been completely closed just moments before. And as they stood there in the quiet aftermath of the morning, the distance between them no longer defined by absence, but by possibility, Ethan Caldwell understood that. For the first time, the timeline was no longer something he was trying to fix, it was something he would have to live through, one day at a time. The quiet outside the school settled into something thinner after the last of the parents drifted away, the sidewalk no longer crowded, the morning noise fading into a distant hum that left Ethan and Nyla standing in a space that felt exposed in a different way, not public, not private, but somewhere in between where every word carried more weight than it had minutes before. Nyla adjusted the strap of her bag once more, a small, habitual motion that gave her something to do with her hands while her gaze remained steady on Ethan, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense, but deliberate, as if both understood that whatever came next would shape more than just this moment. Ethan noticed the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders remained relaxed but her stance stayed grounded, not defensive, not inviting, simply present. And it struck him how different that felt from anything he remembered, because this was not the woman he had left years ago. This was someone who had built stability without him, someone who no longer needed anything from him to remain steady. Where do you go after this? He asked, his voice quieter now, not probing, not demanding, just trying to understand the structure of a life he had never seen. Nyla's eyes held his for a moment longer before she answered, her tone even. Work. And the simplicity of it carried layers he could feel, but not fully grasp yet. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing it, because that single word meant routine, responsibility, independence, all the things he had assumed she would struggle with once he left, assumptions that now felt hollow in the face of what stood in front of him. Can I walk with you? He asked, and this time there was no edge in his voice, no insistence, just a straightforward request. Nyla did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting briefly down the street as if measuring distance, time, or perhaps the weight of the decision itself, and then back to him, her expression still composed. You are already here, she said. Not granting permission, not denying it either, just acknowledging the reality of his presence. Ethan accepted it with a small nod, falling into step beside her again as they began moving away from the school, the rhythm of their footsteps returning, quieter now without Noah's smaller pace between them, but heavier in a way that filled the space he had left behind. The city stretched ahead of them, buildings rising in familiar lines, storefronts opening for the day, people moving with purpose. And Ethan found himself noticing details he would normally ignore. The way sunlight reflected off glass windows, the faint scent of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, the ordinary texture of a morning that felt unfamiliar only because of what had shifted inside him. Nyla walked with the same steady pace, her gaze forward, her attention focused, and Ethan realized that for her, this was just another morning. Not extraordinary, not disrupted, simply continuing as it always had. "What do you do?" he asked after a moment. The question simple, but carrying a genuine need to understand. Nyla did not slow, did not turn, but she answered, "I manage operations for a community health center," her voice calm, the words clear, and Ethan felt another quiet shift in his perception, because that role spoke of responsibility, structure, impact, all things that required consistency and strength. "You built that," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Nyla's lips pressed together. Briefly before she responded, "I built my life," and the distinction settled into place with unmistakable clarity. Ethan glanced at her then, really looking, not just at her posture or expression, but at the presence she carried, the quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. And he understood that what she had built was not just a career or a routine, it was a foundation, one that had held steady long before he arrived back into the picture. "I did not think you would need me," he said quietly, the words coming without defense, without justification, just an admission that felt overdue. Nyla's gaze shifted slightly, not fully toward him, but enough to acknowledge what he had said, and, for the first time, there was a flicker of something closer to emotion beneath her calm, not anger, not resentment, but something more grounded, something shaped by time rather than reaction. "I did not," she replied, her voice steady, but softer than before, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle into him, not as rejection, but as reality. They walked a few more steps in silence, the distance between them no longer measured in feet, but in years, in choices, in everything that had unfolded, without overlap, and Ethan understood that bridging that distance would not come from words alone, but he might. Ethan added after a moment, his voice careful, not claiming, not assuming, just stating what felt undeniable. Nyla stopped then, her steps halting with a precision that signaled the importance of what had just been said, and when she turned to face him fully, the calm in her expression remained, but there was a sharper focus in her eyes, something that demanded clarity. "He needs stability," she said, each word measured, deliberate, not confusion, not inconsistency. And the message beneath the statement was clear enough that it did not need to be spoken directly. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it without resistance, because he understood what she was protecting, what she had spent years building, and what she was not willing to risk. "Then I will not be either," he replied, his voice steady, the words carrying a commitment that felt different from anything he had said before, because this time it was not about intention, it was about action. Nyla held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt like evaluation, like she was weighing not just his words, but the way he held them, the way he stood, the way he had chosen to remain present rather than retreat. "You do not get to come in and out," she said finally, her tone calm, but firm. "If you are here, you are here." And the conditions settled into the space between them, with the weight of something non-negotiable. Ethan did not hesitate this time, did not calculate the cost, did not consider alternatives, because he understood that this was the moment where decision replaced possibility. "Then I am here," he said, the words simple, but anchored in a certainty that did not waver. Nyla watched him for another second, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, but acknowledgement, and she turned back toward the street, resuming her pace without further comment. Ethan fell into step beside her again, the rhythm returning, but something had shifted, Not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that felt foundational, like the first line drawn in something that would take time to build. The city continued around them, unchanged, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening within that shared space. And as they moved forward together, not as they once had, but as something new, undefined but real, Ethan Caldwell understood that this was not about reclaiming what he had lost. It was about proving that he would not lose it again. The rhythm of their steps settled into something quieter as the distance from the school stretched behind them. The morning light now higher, casting longer reflections across the glass storefronts and polished sidewalks, and Ethan Caldwell found himself adjusting not to the city, but to the pace beside him, the steady, unhurried stride that Nyla maintained without looking at him, without needing to confirm that he would keep up. There was something deliberate in the silence now, not empty, not strained, but structured, as if both of them understood that words alone could not carry what needed to be proven. And for the first time, Ethan did not rush to fill that space, allowing it to exist, allowing it to hold the weight of everything that had already been said. A delivery truck rolled slowly past them, the low hum of its engine blending into the background, and a group of office workers crossed the street ahead, their conversations overlapping in soft fragments, but none of it interrupted the focus Ethan felt, not on the environment, but on the person walking beside him, the quiet consistency of her movement, the way she did not adjust her pace for him, did not accommodate, did not resist, simply continued forward as she always had. "What time do you pick him up?" Ethan asked after a moment, his voice measured, not intrusive, just another piece of a routine he was trying to understand. Nyla did not look at him, but she answered, 3:15, and the specificity of it settled into him immediately, another fixed point in a schedule that had existed long before he arrived. Ethan nodded slightly, committing it to memory without needing to say anything further, because he understood that remembering mattered more than repeating. They reached the corner of the next block, the pedestrian signal, counting down in steady red numbers, and Nyla stopped without hesitation, her posture relaxed but attentive, her gaze forward as she waited. Ethan stopped beside her, the brief pause offering a moment where the movement of the city slowed just enough to let his thoughts surface more clearly. "Does he know?" he asked quietly, the question simple, but carrying a weight that had been building since the moment he first saw Noah's face. Nyla's eyes shifted then, not fully toward him, but enough to acknowledge the question before she answered. "No." And the single word landed with a firmness that made it clear there was no uncertainty behind it. Ethan felt something tighten slightly in his chest, not in surprise, but in recognition of what that meant, of how carefully she had protected that boundary, how intentionally she had chosen what Noah knew and what he did not. "Will you tell him?" Ethan continued, his voice steady, not pressing, but unwilling to avoid the reality that stood between them. Nyla inhaled slowly, her gaze still forward as the countdown reached its final numbers, and when she spoke, her tone remained calm, but there was a depth beneath it that had not been there before. "When there is something real to tell." And the condition in her answer settled clearly into place. The signal changed, and they stepped forward together, crossing the street in sync, their movement aligned without discussion. And Ethan understood immediately what she meant, that information alone was not enough, that presence, consistency, proof were the only things that would give that truth meaning. "Then I will give you that," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steadiness that matched the weight of her words. Nyla did not respond, but she did not dismiss it either, and that absence of rejection carried its own significance. They reached the other side of the street, the sidewalk opening into a row of smaller buildings. A cafe on the corner with its doors propped open, the scent of fresh coffee drifting into the air, and Nyla slowed slightly, not stopping, but shifting her pace just enough to acknowledge the place. "I have 10 minutes, she said, glancing briefly toward the entrance before looking back at Ethan, and the statement felt less like an invitation and more like a controlled allowance, a defined space where the conversation could continue without disrupting the structure of her day. Ethan nodded once, understanding the importance of that boundary, and followed her inside, the warmth of the cafe replacing the cool morning air, the low hum of conversation and the soft clink of cups creating a background that felt almost insulated from the Tension they carried in with them. Nyla moved with familiarity toward the counter, ordering without hesitation, her voice calm, her choices simple, and Ethan stood beside her, observing not just what she ordered, but how she moved, the ease of someone who had established a routine, who knew exactly where she stood in every space she entered. When it was his turn, he ordered as well, his voice steady, but his attention still partly on her. On the way she stepped aside, waiting without impatience, without urgency, as if she had learned long ago that time could be managed without rushing. They took their cups and moved to a small table near the window, the light filtering through the glass, casting soft patterns across the surface. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the cafe settling around them. Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup, the warmth grounding him, and he looked at Nyla, really looked, not as a memory, not as a question, but as she was now, present, steady, unchanged by his arrival. "Why did you not reach out?" he asked finally, the question not defensive, not accusatory, but genuine, shaped by a need to understand the choice she had made. Nyla met his gaze, her expression composed, and for a brief second, something deeper moved beneath the surface, something that spoke of decisions made in silence, of moments that had not been shared. "Because you had already chosen," she said, her voice quiet, but firm, "and I was not going to ask you to choose again." And the clarity of it settled into him with a weight that felt both heavy and precise. Ethan absorbed the words without interruption, because he understood what she meant, not just the action, but the principle behind it, the refusal to chase, to convince, to place herself in a position where her value depended on his reconsideration. "You should have had the choice," he said after a moment, the words measured, but carrying an honesty that did not try to soften the past. Nyla shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, but correcting the premise itself. "I did," she replied. "I chose not to wait." And the distinction shifted something in the conversation, reframing the narrative in a way that left no room for him to reposition himself as the center of that decision. Ethan exhaled slowly, the reality of that settling into place, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to reframe, only something to accept. The cafe noise continued around them, unchanged, the quiet rhythm of other lives moving forward, and Ethan realized that this moment, this conversation, was not about revisiting what had happened. It was about understanding what had been built in its absence. "Then let me be part of what comes next," he said finally, his voice steady, the request simple, but grounded in something that did not waver. Nyla held his gaze, the silence returning once more, but this time it felt less like resistance and more like consideration, as if she were measuring not just his words, but the consistency behind them, the willingness to remain present beyond this table, beyond this morning. She took a small sip of her coffee, her movements unhurried, and when she set the cup down, her expression remained composed, but her eyes carried a quiet acknowledgement of what he had said. "We will see," she repeated, the same words as before, but this time they felt less like distance and more like a test, one that had already begun the moment he chose to follow instead of walk away. And as the light shifted slightly across the table, marking the passage of time in subtle increments, Ethan Caldwell understood that this was no longer about proving something in a single moment. It was about showing up in all the moments that followed. The cafe door closed softly behind them as they stepped back onto the sidewalk, the warmth of the interior fading into the crisp clarity of the late morning air. And for a moment Ethan Caldwell paused just half a step behind Nyla, not because he hesitated, but because he recognized something had shifted again, something subtle but significant, like the difference between being allowed to stand in a room and being allowed to remain there. Nyla adjusted her grip on her bag, her posture returning to its steady, forward-facing alignment, and without a word, she resumed walking, her pace unchanged, her rhythm intact, and Ethan followed, not matching her step out of instinct now, but out of intention, a conscious choice to move at the same speed, to exist within the same frame without disrupting it. The city had fully awakened around them, traffic heavier now, voices louder, the hum of activity layering over itself in waves. But within that movement, their silence carried a different weight than before, no longer filled with questions waiting to be asked, but with answers that needed to be proven. Ethan glanced briefly at his watch, not out of impatience, but to understand the structure of her time, the limits she had already defined, and as he lowered his hand, he spoke again, his voice calm, deliberate. "What time do you finish?" The question simple, but grounded in a need to align himself with something real, something repeatable. Nyla did not slow, did not turn, but she answered without hesitation, 5. And the number settled into place, another fixed point, another piece of a schedule that had existed long before he entered it. Ethan nodded once, committing it without comment, because he understood now that remembering mattered more than reacting, that consistency would be built in. Small details, not declarations. They reached the next intersection, the light already green, and crossed without stopping, their movement fluid, uninterrupted, and Ethan realized that every step beside her was an adjustment, not just to pace, but to perspective, to a life that did not revolve around him, did not pause for him, did not need him to function. "I will be there," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not loud, not forceful, just certain. At 3:15, and at 5, and Nyla's gaze shifted then, not fully, but enough to register the statement, to weigh it without responding immediately. They continued walking, the distance between them unchanged, but the space itself feeling different, less guarded, more defined. "You do not need to say it," she replied finally, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet edge of truth. "You need to do it." And the distinction landed exactly where it needed to, cutting through the ease of words and placing the weight back on action. Ethan accepted it without resistance, because it was not something to argue, it was something to meet. "I will," he said simply, and this time there was no elaboration, no attempt to reinforce the statement, just the words themselves, standing on their own. They turned onto a quieter street, the noise of traffic softening behind them, replaced by the low murmur of smaller businesses opening for the day. And Nyla slowed slightly as they approached a building with clean lines and large windows. A subtle sign near the entrance identifying it as the community health center she had mentioned earlier. She stopped just outside the door, turning to face Ethan fully for the first time since they had left the cafe, and the shift in her posture made it clear that this was a boundary, a point where the shared space ended and her world resumed without overlap. "This is where I work," she said, not as an introduction, but as a statement of fact, something that existed independently of him. Ethan looked at the building, then back at her, absorbing the significance of it, not just as a location, but as a representation of everything she had built, everything she had maintained without him. "It suits you," he said, the words simple, but sincere, not as flattery, but as recognition, and for a brief second, Nyla's expression softened, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that Ethan noticed, enough that it registered as something real. "It is mine," she replied, and the clarity of that ownership settled into the space between them. There was a brief pause, the kind that signals the end of a moment rather than the continuation of one, and Ethan understood it immediately, understood that this was where he stepped back, not because he was told to, but because the structure of her life required it. 3:15, he said quietly, not as a reminder to her, but as a confirmation to himself, anchoring the next point of connection. Nyla held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, not agreement, not encouragement, but acknowledgement, and she turned toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle with the same steady motion she had carried all morning. She did not look back as she stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft, final sound that separated their spaces once again. Ethan remained where he stood, the city moving around him, the building now just another part of the street, but the moment lingering in a way that did not fade. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a sense of clarity that had not been there before, because for the first time, the next step was not uncertain. It was defined. He turned and walked back toward the curb, his driver already pulling the car forward, the door opening before he reached it. But this time, the car did not feel like a return to control. It felt like a transition between points, a way to move from one commitment to the next. As he slid into the seat, he did not lean back, did not close his eyes, did not retreat into thought. Instead, he looked out the window, his gaze steady. his focus fixed on what came next rather than what had already passed. "We will be back at 3:15, he said, his voice calm, directed not just at the driver, but at himself, at the decision he had already made. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic, and as the building disappeared behind them, Ethan Caldwell did not feel distance the way he had before, because for the first time, he was not leaving something behind. He was moving towards something he intended to return to. The car moved through the late morning traffic with smooth precision, but Ethan Caldwell did not lean back into the comfort of the seat the way he usually did not reach for his phone, did not allow the familiar rhythm of his routine to reclaim him, because for the first time in years, the structure he had built his life around felt secondary to something else, something that now sat firmly at the center of his attention. His gaze remained fixed on the passing streets, not because he was watching where they were going, but because he was aligning himself with what he had just committed to, each intersection, each passing block marking time in a way that felt different now, not measured in meetings or deals, but in the hours leading up to 3:15. The driver glanced once in the rearview mirror, perhaps expecting direction, perhaps sensing the shift, but Ethan said nothing, his silence intentional, his focus inward, mapping the next part of the day with a clarity that did not require adjustment. When the car pulled up to the glass tower that housed his office, the contrast was immediate, sharp, the polished exterior reflecting the city in clean, controlled lines, a symbol of the world he had dominated for years without interruption. He stepped out, his shoes meeting the pavement with the same confident rhythm they always had, but something in his posture had changed, not visibly to others, but internally, as if the weight he carried had redistributed itself into something more grounded, more deliberate. The lobby doors opened automatically, the cool, conditioned air replacing the warmth of the street, and the familiar environment closed around him, quiet, efficient, designed for control, and yet as he walked through it, Ethan was aware of how little it held his attention compared to what he had just left behind. His assistant rose immediately from her desk, tablet in hand, her expression composed, professional. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell, your 9 o'clock has been waiting for 10 minutes. Her tone precise, her posture aligned with the expectations of his world. Ethan paused for just a fraction of a second, enough to register the statement, enough to understand what it would normally require. And then he nodded once, not with urgency, but with acknowledgement. "Reschedule," he said, his voice calm. Without explanation, without elaboration, the assistant hesitated. Just briefly, a subtle disruption in the seamless flow she was accustomed to. "Sir, this is the Whitman Group," she added, not challenging, but clarifying the significance. Ethan met her gaze, steady, composed. "Reschedule," he repeated, and this time there was no hesitation in his tone, no room for reconsideration. She nodded immediately, adjusting her tablet, the efficiency of her role restoring itself around his decision. But as he moved past her toward the elevator, Ethan was already aware of the shift he had just made, not in terms of business, but in terms of priority, something that had never required adjustment before. The elevator doors closed softly, the ascent smooth and quiet, and Ethan stood alone in the mirrored space, his reflection staring back at him, unchanged on the surface, but carrying a weight that had not been there yesterday. His mind did not drift to the meeting he had just canceled, did not calculate the impact, did not consider the consequences, because for the first time, those variables did not define the moment. Instead, his thoughts returned to the sidewalk, to the steady pace beside him, to the small voice that had said Tyrannosaurus Rex with quiet certainty. And he felt the connection again, not fully formed, not claimed, but present in a way that could not be ignored. The elevator opened onto his floor, the office space unfolding in clean lines and muted tones, employees moving with purpose, conversations low, controlled, and as Ethan stepped into that environment, he understood that nothing here had changed, and yet everything had. He walked into his office, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, he stood still, looking at the expansive windows that overlooked the city, the view wide, impressive, a perspective he had once considered complete. Now it felt partial, as if it showed him everything except the one place he needed to be. His phone buzzed once on the desk, a message from the board, another from a partner, reminders of obligations that had always dictated his time, and he glanced at the screen without picking it up, not ignoring them, but placing them in a position that felt new, secondary, waiting. He moved to his desk, not sitting immediately, but placing his hands on the surface, grounding himself in the space while his mind aligned with the next action. Not a meeting, not a call, but a return. He reached for his calendar, not to adjust the day around his work, but to anchor the 2 points that now mattered most, 3:15 and 5. And as he blocked the time with deliberate precision, he felt something settle into place, not a disruption, but a redefinition. The hours between now and then stretched ahead, but they did not feel empty. They felt purposeful, structured around a commitment that extended beyond intention. He sat down finally, the chair familiar beneath him, and for the first time since he had entered the building, he allowed himself to take a breath that was not measured, not controlled, but real, a moment where the weight of the morning fully registered. His mind returned again to Nyla's words, not the ones that challenged him, but the ones that defined the condition. You do not need to say it, you need to do it, and he understood. With complete clarity that everything he had built, everything he had achieved, meant nothing in this context if it did not translate into presence. The clock on his desk ticked forward, the seconds moving steadily, marking time in a way that felt different now, not as something to manage, but as something to meet. And as the city continued its rhythm beyond the glass, Ethan Caldwell remained exactly where he was, not because he was bound to the office, but because he was aligning himself with the moment he had chosen not to miss, knowing that when the time came, he would not hesitate, he would not delay, he would simply show up, exactly where he said he would be. The minutes moved differently after that, no longer slipping past unnoticed behind layers of meetings and calls, but stretching into something deliberate, something measured not by urgency, but by anticipation, and Ethan Caldwell remained seated at his desk with a stillness that would have seemed unfamiliar to anyone who knew him, his attention not fractured across multiple tasks, but anchored to a single point in time that had yet to arrive. The office around him continued its quiet efficiency, footsteps crossing the polished floor, muted conversations threading through the air, the soft hum of technology filling the spaces between, but none of it reached him in the way it usually did. None of it demanded his immediate response, because for the first time, his focus was not reactive, it was intentional. He glanced once more at the calendar on his screen, the blocks he had placed standing out with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. 3:15 and 5, not just times, but commitments, markers of presence that he had chosen to prioritize over everything else. His phone buzzed again, a call this time, the name of a senior partner flashing across the screen, persistent, expected, and for a brief second, his hand hovered over it, not out of indecision, but out of recognition of what it represented, the world he had always responded to without delay. Then he turned the screen face down, the action simple, controlled, and final, and the silence that followed carried more weight than the call itself ever could have. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the city stretched out in sharp, clean lines, traffic moving in steady patterns below, and he watched it without analyzing, without calculating, just observing, allowing himself a rare moment where the world did not need to be managed. His thoughts returned again, not to the office, not to the deals waiting for him, but to the small, precise details of the morning, the way Noah's voice had sounded when he said Tyrannosaurus Rex, the way Nyla had not rushed her answers, had not filled the silence for him, had allowed him to sit in the weight of what he had missed. And as he replayed those moments, he understood something with a clarity that did not require effort, that nothing he did today would matter if he did not show up exactly where he said he would, exactly when he said he would. The clock on the wall ticked forward, the seconds moving steadily, marking the passage of time with a quiet persistence that he could feel in his chest. And when it finally reached 3 o'clock, Ethan did not hesitate, did not check another message, did not adjust another schedule. He simply stood, his movement smooth, decisive, as if the rest of the day had been nothing more than a lead up to this point. His assistant looked up as he stepped out of his office, her expression composed but attentive. "Sir, the board has requested an update before close of business," she said, her tone professional, her posture aligned with expectation. Ethan met her gaze briefly, his response calm, steady. They will have it tomorrow. And without waiting for acknowledgement, he continued toward the elevator, his steps unbroken, his focus already beyond the building. The descent felt shorter this time. The movement from one space to another no longer a transition between responsibilities, but a return to something he had already chosen. When the doors opened and he stepped back onto the street, the air felt different, sharper, more immediate, and he moved toward the car without hesitation, the driver already prepared. The door opening in sync with his approach. School, Ethan said simply, his voice calm, but carrying the same certainty that had guided him all day, and the car pulled into traffic with smooth precision, merging into the flow without drawing attention. The city moved around them. Afternoon now, the light shifting, the pace changing, but Ethan's focus remained fixed, his gaze forward, his mind not calculating outcomes, but aligning with presence, with the simple act of being where he had said he would be. As the car approached the school, he felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable, the same tightening in his chest that had greeted him that morning. But this time it was not driven by shock. It was grounded in expectation, in the understanding that this moment would not define everything, but it would matter. The car slowed, pulling to the curb just down from the entrance, and Ethan stepped out before it had fully stopped. His movements controlled, but purposeful, his eyes already scanning the sidewalk, the doors, the gathering of parents beginning to form as the day transitioned into its next phase. Children's voices filtered out through the closed doors, faint but present. The energy of the building shifting as the end of the day approached, and Ethan took his place just off to the side, not intruding, not claiming space that was not his, but not standing back either, his presence clear, intentional. He checked the time once, 3:14, then lowered his hand, his gaze returning to the doors, and for a moment, the world narrowed again, not into silence, but into focus, every sound, every movement existing on the edges while his attention remained fixed on what was about to happen. The doors opened, and the first wave of children spilled out. Their voices louder now, laughter, conversation, the natural chaos of a day ending. And Ethan felt his focus sharpen further, his eyes moving through the crowd, searching, not with desperation, but with certainty. And then he saw him, Noah stepping out among the others, his backpack slightly shifted on one shoulder, his steps steady, his gaze scanning the sidewalk for something familiar. Nyla was not there yet, and Ethan understood immediately what that meant, that for a brief moment, this space belonged to him alone, not in ownership, but in opportunity. Noah's eyes moved across the line of waiting adults, pausing for a fraction of a second when they reached Ethan. Not recognition, not yet, but something closer than before, a flicker of familiarity that had not existed that morning. Ethan did not move toward him immediately, did not call out, did not disrupt the natural flow. He simply held his position, allowing the moment to unfold without force, because he understood now that presence was not about taking. It was about being seen, consistently, without pressure, and as Noah's steps slowed just slightly, his gaze lingering a second longer, Ethan Caldwell remained exactly where he was, not reaching, not retreating, simply showing up, exactly as he had said he would. The moment held longer this time, stretching just enough for something unspoken to settle between them. As Noah stood a few feet from the school entrance, his small frame shifting slightly under the weight of his backpack, his eyes no longer scanning the crowd aimlessly but returning, again and again, to the same point where Ethan Caldwell stood without moving, without calling out, without breaking the quiet rhythm that had formed between presence and distance. The afternoon light fell across the sidewalk in soft angles, casting long shadows that moved with the passing of people. But within that motion, there was a stillness that belonged only to them. Something subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, yet undeniable in its weight. Noah took a small step forward, then another, not directly toward Ethan, but not away either, his movement guided by curiosity more than intention, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that seemed to reach beyond his years. Ethan remained where he was, his posture relaxed but grounded, his hands at his sides, resisting every instinct to close the distance too quickly, because he understood now that the space between them was not empty. It was necessary. A few other children passed by, their voices bright, their attention already shifting toward the rest of their day. But Noah lingered, his pace slower, his focus anchored, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow once more, not into silence, but into clarity. "You came back," Noah said. Finally, his voice quiet but certain, the words simple, yet carrying a recognition that had not been there before, and Ethan felt the impact of them immediately, not because of what they were, but because of what they meant. He nodded once, his response steady, measured. "I said I would." And the exchange settled into place, not as a declaration, but as a confirmation of something that had already begun. Noah's eyes held his for another second, then shifted slightly, as if processing the statement, aligning it with something internal, something that was beginning to take shape. Ethan did not step closer, did not reach out. He simply remained present, allowing the moment to unfold without pressure, without expectation, because he understood that this was not something to claim, it was something to earn. "My mom is not here yet," Noah added after a moment, his tone observational rather than concerned, and Ethan nodded again, acknowledging the fact without using it as an opportunity to overstep. "She will be," he said calmly, his voice steady. And Noah seemed to accept that without question, as if the certainty in Ethan's tone carried its own reassurance. They stood there for a few seconds more, the space between them no longer uncertain, but defined by a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to name. A ball rolled across the sidewalk nearby, nudged by another child, and Noah glanced toward it briefly before looking back at Ethan, the small shift grounding him in his age, in the simplicity of his world. "Do you know about dinosaurs?" Noah asked suddenly, his voice carrying a hint of interest. That broke through the stillness, and Ethan felt something soften in response, not dramatically, but enough to meet the moment as it was offered. "I know a little," he replied, his tone calm, open, not trying to impress, not trying to lead, just responding. Noah's expression shifted slightly, a small flicker of engagement passing through his features. "Tyrannosaurus rex is the strongest," he said, his voice gaining a quiet confidence, and Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It is one of the strongest," he agreed, his words careful, not correcting, not dismissing, simply adding to the conversation. Noah seemed to consider that, his gaze narrowing slightly in concentration, and for a brief second, the interaction felt almost ordinary, as if it belonged to a different context, a different history, one where moments like this had always existed. Footsteps approached from the side, steady, familiar, and both of them turned at the same time, Nyla walking toward them with the same composed presence she had carried all morning, her gaze moving first to Noah, checking, confirming, then to Ethan, assessing, measuring. She slowed as she reached them, her posture relaxed but aware, her attention taking in the scene without interruption, and for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the moment to settle on its own. Noah shifted slightly closer to her side, his hand brushing against hers without fully taking hold, a small gesture that spoke of comfort, of familiarity, and Nyla's hand responded instinctively, resting briefly against his shoulder before returning to her side. "You waited," she said to Ethan, her voice calm, not surprised, but acknowledging what had been done. Ethan met her gaze, his response steady. "I said I would." And the repetition carried more weight this time, not as a promise, but as proof. Nyla held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not approval, not acceptance, but recognition, and she turned her attention back to Noah. "Ready?" she asked softly, her tone shifting once more into something warmer, more familiar. Noah nodded, his focus returning to her without hesitation, and together they began to move away from the entrance, the flow of the afternoon carrying them forward. Ethan stepped into pace beside them, not intruding, not leading, simply aligning himself with their movement once again, and for a brief moment, the three of them walked in quiet synchronization, the rhythm natural, unforced, as if the space between them was beginning to adjust, not closing, but shifting into something that could be navigated. The city stretched ahead, the afternoon light settling into a softer tone, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle into something steadier, something less about what had been lost and more about what could still be built. He did not speak again, did not rush to fill the silence, because he understood now that this was not about words, not about explanations, but about presence, repeated, consistent, undeniable. And as they moved forward together, not as they once had, not as strangers either, but as something in between, Ethan Caldwell understood that the distance he was trying to cross would not disappear in a single step, but for the first time, he was not standing still, he was moving with it. The late afternoon settled into a softer rhythm as they moved down the sidewalk together, the earlier rush fading into a quieter flow of people heading home, and Ethan Caldwell became acutely aware of how natural the silence between them had begun to feel, not empty, not strained, but lived in, as if the space no longer needed to be filled with explanations or defenses. Noah walked between them now, not exactly in the middle, but close enough to both that his presence shaped the formation, his small step steady, his attention shifting between the sidewalk ahead and the occasional glance upward, as if he were slowly adjusting to the idea that Ethan was no longer just a figure at the edge of his day. Nyla maintained her pace, her posture composed, her gaze forward, but there was a subtle awareness in the way she moved, a quiet attentiveness that tracked both Noah and Ethan without needing to look directly at either of them. And Ethan recognized that awareness for what it was, not suspicion, not resistance, but control, the kind that came from years of managing everything on her own. They reached a quieter block, lined with trees that filtered the sunlight into softer patterns across the pavement, and Noah's steps slowed slightly, his attention caught by something ahead, a small display of toy figures in the window of a corner store, dinosaurs arranged in neat rows, their shapes instantly recognizable. He stopped without thinking, his gaze fixed, and Nyla slowed beside him, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder, not pulling him away, not encouraging him to linger, simply acknowledging the pause. Ethan stopped as well, a step behind, observing the moment without stepping into it, because he understood now that not every silence required his presence, not every pause needed his participation. "Look," Noah said quietly, his voice carrying that same quiet excitement from earlier, his eyes tracing the shapes in the window, and Nyla nodded once, her expression softening slightly as she followed his gaze. "I see them," she replied, her tone gentle, and for a brief second, the moment existed entirely between them, a simple exchange that had nothing to do with anything else. Ethan watched, not intruding, but present, and after a moment, Noah glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes landing on Ethan again, this time with less hesitation, less distance. "That one is a velociraptor," Noah said, pointing toward the display, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to stand beside them, his movements still measured, still careful. "They are fast," he said, his voice calm, adding to the observation without taking it over, and Noah nodded, satisfied, his attention returning to the display for another second before shifting back to the sidewalk. "We cannot stop," Nyla said, gently, her hand guiding Noah forward again, her tone not strict, but firm in the way that carried routine, and Noah accepted it without protest, his steps picking up again as they continued down the street. Ethan fell back in a pace beside them, the moment passing without disruption, but leaving behind a subtle shift, something small but meaningful in the way Noah had chosen to include him, even briefly. They turned onto another block, the buildings transitioning into a quieter residential area, and Ethan noticed the change immediately, the way the noise softened, the way the air felt different, less crowded, more grounded, and he understood that they were approaching a space that belonged entirely to Nyla and Noah, a place he had not yet been invited into. Nyla slowed again as they reached a modest building with clean lines and well-kept steps, the entrance simple, unassuming, and she stopped at the base of it, turning toward Ethan with a clarity that signaled another boundary. Noah moved instinctively closer to her side, his hand finding hers without looking, and she responded in kind, her fingers wrapping around his in a gesture that felt both natural and protective. "This is where we live," she said, her voice calm, not offering, not denying, simply stating the fact. Ethan looked at the building, then back at her, absorbing the weight of it, not just as a location, but as a life that had been built entirely without him, a space filled with routines, memories, and moments he had never witnessed. "It looks like a good place," he said, his tone steady, not overreaching, not trying to claim familiarity, just acknowledging what he could see. Nyla held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, not responding directly to the comment, but not dismissing it either. There was a pause then, the kind that marked the end of a shared stretch, the moment where paths naturally diverged, and Ethan understood it immediately, the same way he had understood every boundary she had set that day. 5, he said quietly, not as a reminder to her, but as a continuation of what had already been established. And Nyla's eyes met his again, steady, evaluating. 5, she repeated, her tone even, confirming the point without adding anything further. Noah glanced between them, his attention catching on the repetition, and for a brief second, he seemed to consider it, as if trying to understand what it meant, what it implied. Ethan did not elaborate, did not explain, because he knew that meaning would come from action, not words. He stepped back slightly, creating the space that the moment required, not retreating, but respecting the structure she had built. Nyla turned toward the steps, guiding Noah with her, and they began to move toward the entrance, their pace steady, their movement aligned. And for a brief second, Noah looked back, his gaze finding Ethan once more, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging, and Ethan responded with a small nod. The exchange quiet, but real. The door opened, and they stepped inside, the space closing behind them with a soft finality that marked the end of the moment, but not the connection. Ethan remained where he was for a few seconds longer, the quiet of the residential street settling around him, the absence of their presence noticeable in a way that felt different from before, not empty, but defined. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and he turned back toward the sidewalk, his steps measured as he moved away, not with the sense of leaving something behind, but with the understanding that he would return, exactly as he had said. The city stretched ahead again, the afternoon shifting toward evening, and Ethan Caldwell carried with him something that had not been there before, not certainty, not resolution, but direction, clear, unwavering, grounded in the simple act of showing up, again and again, until the space between them no longer needed to be measured. The quiet of the street lingered even after the door closed behind Nyla and Noah, a soft stillness settling into the space where their presence had just been, and Ethan Caldwell remained there a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed not on the building itself, but on the idea of what existed behind it, a life defined by routines he had only begun to glimpse, a rhythm he had stepped into for a single day but had not yet earned a place within. The late afternoon light shifted slowly, casting longer shadows along the sidewalk, and for the first time since the morning, Ethan allowed himself to feel the weight of the distance fully, not the physical space between them, but the years, the missed mornings, the unspoken moments that had shaped everything he was now trying to understand. He exhaled slowly, steady and controlled, not in frustration, not in regret alone, but in recognition, because what stood in front of him was not something that could be corrected with a single decision. It was something that required time, consistency, presence, the very things he had not given before. He turned away from the building with measured steps, not rushing, not lingering, his movement grounded in something that felt clearer than anything he had known that morning. And as he walked back toward the curb, the city began to re-enter his awareness, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet murmur of voices, the soft rhythm of a day moving toward evening. The car pulled up beside him with its usual precision, the door opening in quiet expectation, but Ethan did not step in immediately, his attention drawn back for just a second, his gaze returning to the building, not searching, not waiting, simply acknowledging. Then he moved, sliding into the seat, the door closing behind him with a soft final sound. And as the car pulled away, he did not look back again, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that leaving this time was not the same as before. The ride back through the city felt different, not shorter, not faster, but more defined, each passing block marking the distance between where he had been and where he would return, not as a question, but as a certainty. When the car reached his building, the glass exterior catching the last light of the day, Ethan stepped out with the same composed presence he had always carried. But something within him had shifted, something subtle but foundational. a recalibration that no one else could see, but that shaped every step he took. Inside, the lobby remained unchanged, polished, efficient, the quiet hum of business continuing without interruption, and his assistant looked up as he approached, her expression composed, attentive. "The board is still waiting for your update," she said, her tone professional, measured, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without allowing it to take precedence. "Tomorrow morning," he replied calmly, his voice steady, and without waiting for further discussion, he moved past her, the decision already made. The elevator ride up felt quieter now, not because the building had changed, but because his focus had. The reflection in the mirrored walls no longer just a confirmation of identity, but a reminder of the responsibility he had chosen to accept. When he reached his office, the space greeted him with the same order, the same control, the same structure that had once defined everything, and he stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sealed him into a world he understood completely. He moved to his desk, not immediately sitting, but placing his hands against the surface once more, grounding himself in the moment, aligning the two parts of his life that now existed in parallel, one built over years of precision and strategy, the other just beginning, fragile, undefined, but undeniably real. His phone buzzed again, another message, another demand, and this time he picked it up, not to retreat into that world, but to manage it on his terms. His response is brief, controlled, efficient, clearing space rather than filling it, making room for what mattered without abandoning what remained. As the last message was sent, the office grew quiet again, the light outside shifting toward evening, and Ethan sat down, his posture relaxed but steady, his gaze moving once more to the calendar, to the blocks of time that now carried more significance than any meeting ever had. He did not need to add anything, did not need to adjust, because the structure was already in place, the next morning already forming in his mind with the same clarity as the day before, the same commitment, the same intention. He leaned back slightly, allowing himself a moment of stillness, and in that quiet, the memory of Noah's voice surfaced again, simple, unguarded. The way he had said "you came back," and Ethan understood with a clarity that did not require effort that those words were not a conclusion. They were a beginning, a small recognition that would only grow if it was met with consistency. The clock on the wall ticked forward, the seconds steady, unchanging, and Ethan did not rush them, did not try to fill them. He simply allowed them to pass, knowing that each one brought him closer to the next moment that mattered. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating the skyline in a pattern he had seen countless times before. But tonight, it felt different. Not because the view had changed, but because his perspective had. This was no longer the center of everything. It was just one part of a life that now extended beyond glass walls and controlled environments, into sidewalks and school doors and quiet conversations that carried more weight than any boardroom ever could. Ethan Caldwell